Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think we're going to start. We're letting people in. We're over 100 now, so ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, everyone, from the Center for Palestine Studies, based here in Columbia University, New York City. And welcome to the start of our spring 2021 semester of events. This is the 10th anniversary year of CPS, Center for Palestine Studies, and at the center of our programming this semester is this amazing collaboration with our friends and colleagues at LIFTA Volumes, who I'll be introducing in a moment. This semester-long program explores contemporary Palestinian cultures and yearnings across generations in Palestine and its diaspora. And we have an amazing lineup of live panels, videos, podcasts, film screenings, and many other social media events throughout the course of the semester. The program is entitled Palestine in Between, and it's co-sponsored by the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities and the Center for Archaeology at Columbia University. Just a couple of administrative points before I hand over to our speakers and guests today. We will hear from our panelists and directors and speakers and so on, and we will have a session of Q&A towards the end. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will deal with that in the latter part of the session today. I would ask you also to turn off your sound, mute yourselves during the discussion, and then we can hear what our speakers have to say. Okay, I'm now going to turn over to our colleagues Leila Penado and Amira Assad at LIFTA. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for joining. I'm one of the co-founders of LIFTA alongside Leila. We co-run the space. It's a multidisciplinary platform. We're based in Mexico City, and we create projects across mediums from books to exhibitions to films. And our most recent project was a book on future Palestine that came out last year. So we're excited to kick off the program with Muna and Juna and Nadia. Also joining us for this program is Lina Mansour, who's going to speak in just a second, and Share Assad, and Leila's going to hop in with just a little bit of information about what we're going to be getting into this semester.
Hello, I'm Leila. So this program is called Palestine in Between. And kind of the main purpose and focus of this program is to show the full spectrum of what it means to be Palestinian across locations, generations, disciplines, trying to bring up the more untold stories, the Palestinians that kind of get lost in between. And it's going to be a semester-long program that lasts until April, the end of April. And you can sign up to the CPS mailing list to get updates and new information that will be released weekly. We just wanted to thank everyone for their support, including the panelists, Brian and Simone. We appreciate you and all of your work, and we're looking forward to the conversation. Oh, also, I'm gonna pass it off to Lina Mansour, and she'll introduce the panelists.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lina Mansour. I'm so happy to be programming this semester, co-programming this semester at the Center for Palestine Studies with Amira Assad, Leila Penado, co-founders of LIFTA, and Share Assad, along with all of you from the CPS team, Simone, Brian, and Naz. It's such a fantastic way to start the program with two very unique personalities and directors, Juna Suleiman and Benyamin. And Juna's Mussolini's sister and Muna's Trouble in Paradise and Moonscape. They're a breath of fresh air in the presentation of Palestinian cinema and narratives, and they're narratives that are based on real life, honesty, personal stories and perspectives from the past, the present, and the future. The films that are any individual in the world that can relate to, regardless of location or generation. So along with all of you, I'm so excited to listen to this conversation. It will be moderated by Dr. Nadia Yaqub, Professor of Arab Culture in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the author of Palestinian Cinemas in the Days of the Revolution. So Dr. Nadia, Juna, and Muna, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lina.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let me just quickly thank the Center for Palestine Studies, Nas, Simone, everybody else. It really is wonderful to be a part of this project, and I'm really excited to see the other events in this in the series. It's just amazingly important work that you're all doing, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. I'm going to jump right into asking a few questions, and then down the road a bit, take some of the questions that the audience has. I know you mostly want to hear from Mona and Juna rather than me, so I'll try and keep my questions brief. So I'd like to begin with just some general questions. If you could each introduce yourselves by telling us what brought you to filmmaking in general and to these projects in particular. Maybe we could start with Juna and then Mona.
Yeah, sure. You hear me? Hi to everybody, and thank you for having us in this. We're very excited about this event. So basically what brought me to filmmaking, I was exposed to films ever since I was a child. My parents were cinephiles, and they used to see a lot of films in Haifa. Also, there was a video shop in Nazareth. Only television in Israel would show lots of Hitchcock, Twin Peaks, and Monty Python. So I've always been exposed. But when I was 15 years old, that was the first time I was on set. And it was when working with my uncle, Nadia Suleiman, on his Chronicle of a Disappearance. I worked on all his films, casting 2 films. And while studying and working in other films and productions, I was getting to realize how much the politics of representation, the politics of identity were actually very much dominating Palestinian films. So to the extent that as a Palestinian, when watching the film, I didn't feel that many of the films were talking about us or addressing us directly. Also, when applying to funds abroad with films that I wanted to represent through them and other stories and underrepresented narratives, it was very difficult because the audience abroad and in general, people, in general, the audience and the funds, they give money for films that address the Palestinian struggle the way in the eyes of the audience, so of the foreign audience. So what brought me to make this film was a kind of retreat that I wanted to take into my grandmother's house. Studying the materials turned the eye to what was remarkably human and not just about being Palestinian. That's basically it. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Mona, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I would like thank the Center for Palestinian Studies and Lifta for having us here. What I actually got to filmmaking pretty much by accident. I signed up for fine art studies a year after I graduated from high school because I wanted to pursue my interest in painting. But during foundation year, we like the rule is basically that you have to get exposed to different kinds of medium. And we had a video class where we had to present assignments every other week. So in one of the assignments, I needed actors, and the most available people and willing were my parents. So we started shooting some things around the house, and when I saw them for the first time on screen in the academy, it was just it was a turning point, because I realized that these people that I'm so used to them being just my parents have an excellent presence on screen. So since then, I started incorporating them in my filmmaking, and just discovering things in my relationship with them, my relationship with filmmaking, and just went on this journey. But everything was purely accidental. I mean, if we didn't have that foundation course, I'm not sure I would have ended up being a filmmaker.
Interesting. Great. Well, you've both touched on involving family members in your filmmaking, and I want to delve into that in more depth. But before I get to that, is there anything you'd like to share with us in general before we get to speaking about your films and your use of family members, about your filmmaking process, the aesthetic or technical choices that you make that you think are crucial to how you produce your works? Yeah.
Want to start?
Yeah.
Who starts?
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, when I started working on the films, I think the biggest choice I made was to work with existing and familiar templates. I mean, in Trouble in Paradise, it's the sitcom, and Moonscape, it's the music video.
Yeah.
That decision came when I was working on Trouble in Paradise, when I was first started structuring it. And because I was working with a lot of sensitive topics and a lot of very dark jokes that relate to a certain generation and a certain outlook on coping and on dealing with trauma, I was the thing that interested me most and that I was most curious about is how an audience from my parents' generation, a Palestinian audience from that generation, would perceive the film, and what they would get from these jokes. And I realized that if the film was to be too abstract and not something that they were used to seeing, it would be much more difficult for them to understand it. So I decided to go with a format that is pretty much already so implanted in the mainstream that everyone consumes and everyone knows. And in order to make my work more accessible. And when I started working with those familiar templates, I discovered also that it's a much better way for me to understand what I'm doing, because the moment that you have a machine, every wire and every plug, has its significance and has its role. So just testing out which wire does what, and when you disconnect this, it does that, is basically what I was trying to do. I just take these familiar templates and try to make them as dysfunctional as possible to suit the need of the film or the message, if you want to call it that way. And the other decision was to work purely at home and only with my parents. Apart from being the actors, they're also the producers. They help me with building the set. They help me setting up the lighting and the camera. And it's just a very narrow staff that I work with. And it comes from the fact that it's most comfortable for us three. When you let a stranger into your house, it can ruin the dynamic. So I think these two are the biggest decisions that I made in my process.
Well, I find this fascinating because basically what you're describing is that by imposing a frame on yourself, a particular frame that comes from outside your work in terms of using these templates, And by embracing the requirements of limited funding and whatever the character of the outside is that makes it most comfortable to be inside the home to work, you've released your own creativity. It's sort of, I mean, it's a truism. It's sort of banal to say, but it's really interesting to see that enacted in your work. Juna, are there aspects of your process or technique that you'd like to highlight at the start?
I started filming in 2011. So basically it took about 6 years of filming, 7 years of filming and editing till it was released. The process was very long. It was a kind of a lonely project for a lot of time. I took the first camera I found from a friend and started filming the moment my grandmother agreed. And the nature of filming was more observational in the beginning. I was like filming a fly on the wall in the beginning, and I wasn't very in touch with either filming. I never took a camera in my hands. So the process started like a sort of a private film school, which I learned a lot from. And I was with full access inside her house, day and night. Of course, she's my grandmother, so I can shoot her even when she's asleep. This kind of connection made me also made me more connected to her, because I was revealed to her in all her situations, when she was hyperactive and spiteful and funny, and even when she started deteriorating physically. This kind of connection to the material had to be, every time I viewed the material after I was shooting, I had to study the material myself. So like I have endless papers written on the work of those years. And because I had little dialogue with people in my area and my field, when I was filming, so it made it a very difficult. It made it difficult for me to also edit. I had to edit alone since 2013. I had to try a lot of things. It was a study. But when I started editing with Alex Bakri, who's an editor and a filmmaker himself, and we had an amazing time editing this film. It was, I got his help. I needed his help to get to be disconnected from the materials and to try and view them as materials and not as my grandmother, and be less sensitive about what to show and what not to show. This took a lot of time, but we were experimenting with the footage a lot, and that shows in the film as well, that we weren't trying to be true to what was in the time of the shooting. And this I will talk more about later. That we were doing manipulations that were actually showing how much her character is round, and the editing process was actually at the time that this film was actually written. Up until that moment, I wasn't trying to write the film in its fullest. I wasn't trying to impose my ideas on the film. I was trying to learn from what I had and not be the director who came knowing everything. So in a way, it was, even though it was a very challenging period, because I worked with very little budget. In the beginning, first 3 years, I worked with no budget. I had to also survive from working and casting films and buy equipment in order to work on my own and try working without limitations. But despite the challenges, it was there's a lot of gratitude in having so much freedom to work like that. Yeah.
I love this idea of learning from your material and letting it shape your project rather than coming with a preconceived notion. That I think that there are qualities of that show in the work. Great. So since I know this is a theme of this particular event, and you've already both mentioned it, if we could pursue a little bit more this idea of how you both work with your family members, and you've both spoken about the opportunities. I'd like to hear a little more about the challenges that you've both faced, and then also how your family members have responded to the works after, you know, I assume that they've seen them, or maybe not. And not just the family members who've appeared in the films, but you know, other family members. If you care to talk about that. And we can switch the order again if you like. Go ahead, Juna. Yeah.
Well, basically, I chose to work with my grandmother, not because she's my grandmother, because she has a very unique character. Yeah. And that was the idea to make this film happened in 2001, actually. And she was a different woman entirely. She was hyperactive, very obsessive compulsive to dangerous points. Like she used to take out the huge glass of the house and clean it and put it back at age 70. And yeah, she was like a superwoman. And also she was spiteful with the vendor downstairs. She would open the hose on him so people don't go inside if he's not paying her or if he did something that she didn't like. So there was like this entire scenario that I wanted to go with in my second year in film studying, and she didn't agree to be filmed then. And when I came back after this fatigue of Palestinian representation, I came back to look at my immediate surrounding and work with her. It was very ironic that she was the only actual connection for me with the Nakba. And she didn't want to speak about it at all. And the film didn't want to be speaking about that. It wanted to speak about her present, not how she symbolizes the past, not try to impose stuff on her that don't belong to her, because it shows also in the film the complexity of living in Israel and the segregation she made for herself. So the challenges were mainly that she had no interest in cinema. She didn't know cinema. She didn't like cinema. She didn't think of my profession as something serious. She didn't take me seriously. She would pause after 3-4 years of filming, look at me in the middle of the shooting and tell me, why don't you go film the vendor downstairs? Why don't you go film the meat stores downstairs? And this, of course, was difficult in the time of shooting, because she would think I would just aimlessly go after her. And when will this cassette end, she would ask. She called it the cassette. But the main challenge was, I spoke about it a bit earlier, was to separate myself from her. During the shooting, it was very, very difficult, especially if she was painful. If she was suffering from pain, and if she's needing my help, and sometimes I have to like tell her in a bit or make her wait, and I didn't feel right about that. But with time I understood that the difficulty came because we loved each other, and I couldn't actually, and the camera was a kind of a barrier between us in the relationship. And editing became even much more of a barrier, because I had to see less of her in order to, like, I would see her every day in the footage, and I had to see her as a character. And I had to also take some sort of time off from seeing her. And filmmaking did affect our relationship also in a negative sense because of that. But there were far more opportunities than challenges. There had been, for me, I had full access, like I said, to her life. She was an amazing character, and with my uncle, they produced dialogues that I never read in scripts I casted. Like they're brilliant dialogues for fiction films. Some parts, like after I filmed them and went back home to watch them, they appeared to me like it was a fiction film being, there's an actor and he's given the dialogue. And for me, this gave a lot of inspiration in the process. So this also, their unconditional love and the way she gave herself to the film. Her only aim was that I succeed. She said she wanted me to have a trophy before she died, and that she would like to leave a memory. But I think it's less that and more the fact that our families are like brilliant producers, brilliant participants, because they're giving us everything we need, and it's something that you can't have again in any other cinematic experience.
Yeah, great. Great. And has she seen the film?
Yes, she's seen it. She said, I asked her, what do you think? She said, not bad. Yeah. Of course, it was very difficult for her to see it. It was years after I shot, like what she saw in the beginning of the film, she didn't remember so much. She didn't realize that that was her so much and that this happened before. She had no memory of it. Also because her physical and mental condition deteriorated since then. Yeah. So before I showed her, like when I was editing the film, I was scared that she will never be able to see it, or she'll see it, but she'll hate it. In general, when you have someone look at themselves in a film, it's very difficult for them to look at themselves. And she was feeling uneasy. We made a private, a personal screening at my uncle's house with a poster, and she signed the poster, and it was like, she was like dressed for the occasion, and we saw the film together. So we wanted to neutralize the tension there. At some point when Mussolini came up in the film and everybody was like engaged in the film and she wasn't scared that they're laughing at her or something like that, she became engaged more and more. And I think that the family in general perceived it very well. My family loves the film, and they think it is very close to her character. It's exactly what they talk about all the time. The extended family, Mussolini's family as well, got to see the film and loved it, and couldn't stop talking about it. It was great to receive all of this from the family. Maybe I'm a little bit unsure about the representation of my uncle in the film, because I had to be unjust towards him a little bit in order to design the narrative properly. But he seemed okay with most of it. Like he said something about the time he screamed at her, that it's not so nice for him and everything. But he's like, he deserves a film of his own. He's a great personality, a great character, and I couldn't put much more of him in the film. I had to be very truthful to her world and her point of view.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I feel as if the love between them definitely comes through, despite some of the harsh dialogue. The critique of her cooking. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Mona.
Yes. I think there's a lot of similarity. I mean, between the way what Juna described and what I'm going to describe. Basically, the biggest challenge when working with families is that you have to be extra sensitive and extra aware of everything that's going on, that's surrounding you. Because in my case, I make my parents dress up. They're wearing costumes. They don't exactly appear as themselves. It's not a documentary, and it doesn't pretend to be one. So when their identity, when they're not even hidden also behind a character. They're not acting. They're themselves, but they're in disguise. So I had to be very, very attentive to their needs while filming, and see, because they weren't comfortable with all of my suggestions for the scenes. But on the other hand, you have to be a bit firm sometimes in order to balance their needs with the needs of the film. But the opportunities are much more great than the challenges. They're very dedicated. You will never find anyone, any actor or any producer or any director that will be as dedicated to what you're doing than your family. Because my family they agreed to participate in my films because they wanted me to finish my studies, and they wanted me to excel them, and they knew that working with them is basically the correct recipe for that path, because I work best when I work with them. So they gladly agreed to participate, and it brought us much closer together. We got to learn from each other and learn about each other a lot through the process of creating the films. And also they stretch out to be more than just actors or just the cast of the film. They helped me with everything from point zero. My dad was negotiating the prices of the decor that we used in Moonscape at the store, and for Trouble in Paradise we had to move the furniture around the house constantly in order to create some like illusions of different sets. So during that filming day, while they had their costumes on and the heels and the suits and everything, we were taking couches, moving them from one side to the other, and they didn't complain. They did a little bit, but overall they were all on board. I mean, super dedicated, super loving, and you know that you're working with them and that they have your best interest in mind, even more than you have for yourself. So it's a real blessing.
That's wonderful. Yeah. It occurs to me, you put your family members in positions of vulnerability in these works, though. So by having your parents dress up and appear in clothes that I assume in ways they don't normally appear, having them speak, tell these jokes in languages in English when they don't know English. And Juna, in your case, obviously, representing on screen your grandmother's illness and irritability. You've put your beloved family members in positions of vulnerability. And I'm wondering what strategies you practiced to protect them in your work, so that they, to make sure that they don't become, the objects of ridicule or feel violated. And Mona, you can start.
I mean, I agree completely that there's a lot of vulnerability in both of our films, but I mean, every person you put in front of a camera is subjected to vulnerability, because in that moment you're out of your control. You don't control your representation anymore, and a machine basically controls it, and the director, of course. So, but to avoid, I mean, the mockery is a bit more complicated in that sense. And about the vulnerability, I mean, I tried as much as possible to be attentive to their needs while shooting.
Yeah.
But also when I put them in positions where they were speaking a language that they don't understand, I made sure to do the treatment in the editing, which is basically the structure of the film, where at first, they're telling these jokes in English, and most of the time they didn't understand what they were saying unless they asked me to translate. So I did. But that usually happened after we shot each joke. They would say it, and then they would ask me what it means. So at the time of the shooting, they didn't really understand what they were performing. But so the confusion and the vulnerability is much more present at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
But I think that the moment the language switches to Arabic, their entire presence in front of the camera changes, and their looks towards the camera and towards the viewer shows that they're in a position of power, and they leave the film as they're victorious by the end of the film, because they're standing there, they're looking you straight in the eye, telling very, very dark jokes, and continuing on with their day. And so basically the uncomfortableness that they were feeling in the beginning because of the language differences is kind of is reversed, and the viewer is the one that remains uncomfortable rather than my parents. So this is how I try to treat it in Trouble in Paradise, and I think I will pass it on to Juna.
I agree with you, Mona, because I think the moment you put your parents in front of a camera and they are in a film, they cease to be themselves. They become characters. So, but I had that feeling that I was putting my grandmother in a place of vulnerability, especially after I shot her in the bed when she was like aching in bed so much. And then a few days later, I opened my computer and looked at what I shot, and I immediately shut down my computer. I said, okay, I'm not going to shoot this film anymore. That was like maybe in the third year. And this is too much, and I can't position my grandmother in this sort of visual. But it wasn't true. It was part of, the vulnerability is part of the work, and I think no one on earth would be scared that she would be exposed to mockery or vulnerability than me. I mean, she's is someone who I want to protect more than anybody I've worked with. She's my own grandmother. But in general, in order to create a full dimensional character with flaws and to make I mean, this is what the crowd usually loves, people with flaws. You do use sometimes this mockery as a tool, not in order to open it up for people for laughter only. You use it as a tool to contradict the character. And by contradicting her, people can see the different aspects of her personality. Plus, in my grandmother's case, she had full agency from the beginning. The voiceover gave her full agency. We would use everything she thinks about, also her past, her present, the politics, everything that comes in their life. And all of these elements just, I think, protect her from being mocked. And even if the crowd laughs at her or with her at a certain point, they learn to also be sad with her and to be in pain with her. So this is like in every other film. Also, the comic feature and the vulnerability features are in all films we see. It depends on the integrity of the artists themselves and the filmmaker. It's something you engage within your work. If you are someone who wouldn't want to harm people that way, you wouldn't simply do it. You'll be cautious not to do it during your work. It demands a lot of sensibility. Yes.
Yeah, I think that specifically in your film, Juna, it wouldn't have been the same film if you tried to conceal all these imperfections. I mean, the most, what shows her strength and her strong presence is the way she curses, the way she swears, the way she manipulates people. I mean, it's brilliant. And at the end, the bottom line that this is a feature film about an old woman who's getting her full screen time. So I think that's super empowering and the opposite of mockery. I mean, it's just you take the time to build this complex character, and that does her a lot of justice. I mean, in that sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I think there's a real power there. You mentioned, an older woman who gets her full screen time. I mean, you can think of this in the Palestinian context, whereby one doesn't have to be a hero or a victim of terrible violence to get on screen, but also in a gendered context, one doesn't have to be young and beautiful to get one's full, and more globally to get one's time on screen, and that's quite. I think
the audience is smarter, way smarter now than before, because we're more exposed to television, and series don't use this kind of casting anymore. I mean, television series give you people that resemble the people you will see in the street, and right now we're even less. I'm less liking films with pretty characters and flawless characters. I mean, it's just nobody likes characters like this. People love the characters who have something bad about them a little, and when they understand where it's coming from, and there this kind of sympathy happens or empathy happens. But yes, in general, audiences are not dumb, or they're seeing a lot, and they know what they're seeing, and they want to be given something extraordinary on screen.
I think that also in relation to Palestinian filmmaking in general, there's because most of it, the ones that are reaching the mainstream are much directed at the West. So they're always trying to sell this their sob stories about the occupation, and the characters are always in a place that they're weak in front of the world. And in Juna's film, basically, Hiam did not victimize herself for a minute, and Juna did not look at her as a victim. She's carrying on with her life, and all the effects of the trauma and all of the the baggage that she accumulated across the years is reflected in her coping mechanism in her day-to-day life, and does not necessarily have to be worded out and saying, oh, I suffered this, oh, I suffered that.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's what makes it more reliable and more honest. I mean, the fact that it isn't trying to sell itself to the West to just show them that here, you see, we're suffering.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you
That's
shouldn't- yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, related to that, I mean, you know, you use the word selling yourself to the rest, to the West. There's a financial aspect to that, of course, which relates to film funding and so on. And so maybe that could be a good segue into talking about that. I know both of you've chosen, and well, you've worked with very, very small budgets. And if you could speak a little bit about funding and infrastructure, your experience as Palestinian filmmakers working in Israel, you know, based in Israel, in relation to your projects.
I created both of my films during my academic studies.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't even think of funding as an option, and I don't think anyone would have accepted a student's submission for a film. Trouble in Paradise was shot with a budget of $60, I think, overall. Everything we used was we had at home, and all I had to buy was the wig and the makeup for my mom and gel for my dad's hair. That was the construction of the entire thing. And Moonscape was a bit more pricey because I worked with a music producer whom I paid. But apart from that, the singers who performed the song, Dima Azar and Luay Srouji and Juna, who edited the film for me, all refused to get paid, which is an act of generosity that I got super, super lucky to work with these amazing people. And all I had to buy was the decor. I got the equipment from school, but I think that working with budgets is a lot of restraints and a lot of expectations. And when you're working with something so experimental and so fragile, you want the least of that, because you really want to be focused on what you want and what you want to achieve. So it's a lot of background noise, but I'm sure life is going to get more complicated in the future.
if you work in bigger budgets.
If I continue with this path.
Yeah.
Well, one way or another, you have to work with budgets in the future. The problem is the lack of resources. There's a huge lack of resources, especially for films like ours, even though they're very different, but it's very hard to fund films like that. First, because there are not films that address the occupation at Palestine, Israel in a traditional way. Also because this was more of a private choice. In the beginning, I really wanted to work independently. And I know I've been working in film a lot of time, and I know how funds work. So I was wanting to try on my own for a lot of time and not have the interference of producers who tell me you have to finish the film in the same year or something like that. That was the first 2-3 years. But then it was obvious that I cannot go on like that with a film like this, with a feature, because I would have to always work for other people and never realize my own ideas. So at some point, after getting rejected from all the Arab funds and the Western funds, I just decided to work with an Israeli fund after I really tried not to. I really, really didn't want to. But luckily, the fund that gave money was very low budget. There were a group of cinephils who gave me full freedom to work for all those years. And that's actually not the case in Israel at all. And of course, I also, it's not just a matter of funds, also the distribution. I mean, this film didn't have a traditional way of funding and distributing at all. I had to go about it almost on my own with the help of my producers, because it carries the Israeli identity as well. And luckily it is, I think it couldn't reach the Arab world. I also never applied because I knew that. And I can't have the kind of conversation I want with colleagues around the world, with other filmmakers. It keeps you trapped. It's not an Israeli film, and it's not considered fully a Palestinian film. And that was a huge problem. So I lowered my expectations in its festival life and after. I think the direct connection I have the most is with the audience itself that saw the film. And in general, having to go through the Israeli institution here, also, if you're not privileged enough to go study abroad, then you have to, like me and Mona, we had to study here. And we didn't have to, like, we didn't want to be, I didn't want to be part of any Israeli community. Of course, I was always politicized. I knew I never wanted to belong to that community, but it's not like the Palestinian community here is easier. And it's not easy also with filmmakers here because of the nature of it being a very, very limited industry, not even an industry. Only certain films get the budget and other people don't get. So it's kind of, it limits the films that can be made here, including this film that I made as well. And and the process can become very tiring and a lot of insecurity in it because you find yourself totally alone in the process and you never get to realize it like anybody else. Like talk to people about your work, find the right people to work with. Everything takes too much time. But as I said, I mean, despite the hardship in it, there's a lot of freedom in it as well.
Yeah.
Or working with minimal resources. People just don't, funds don't interfere anymore. Producers don't interfere, and then you have full freedom. But that's, I think, one-time thing. I don't think that my next movie can be like that entirely. It's very hard not to fund the film.
Yeah, yeah. I've got several questions I'd like to ask you about your individual films. But before we go to that, I see that there are several questions in the chat. And one is about censorship. Someone is asking about the effect of censorship on your work. You've already addressed this a little bit in terms of the circulation in your film. And this person, Yuri Zwahlen, is also asking if you have anything to say about the censorship of Janine Janine by Muhammad Bakri. So if either of you would like to address questions of censorship.
I didn't have any censorship in my film. There's nothing in it that I can be persecuted about, really. Maybe just my grandmother can be put in prison after everything she's saying. But I'm against censorship in general, whether Muhammad Bakri or any other director. I think it's unjust towards any, like, we should be able to see all films and I mean, I don't have anything to say about it really. I think it's one of many acts done by the Israeli state to censor work, to prevent certain artists from speaking out. And this goes for many artists and filmmakers. This happened a lot before. I think we stand against it in general.
Yeah.
Obviously, we stand against it. I mean, I experienced censorship in a very unpleasant way that I will not be getting into for personal reasons. But I mean, it's. I mean, what can we say? We're obviously against it, but I personally stopped being shocked by it because we know we live in an occupation state that every single movement that you do that does not sit well with their agenda is going to get censored. And a lot of cases have been censorship is just going higher and higher each year. I mean, a Palestinian poet named Dareen Tatour, she posted a poem on her personal Facebook page, and she was imprisoned for 5 months. And during her trial, when the entire process of prosecuting her was going on, they did not have a single Arabic speaker. They did not have any person who comes from the field of literature that can provide an analysis to what she wrote that is beyond the very narrow point of view and the very narrow lens that they chose to see the poem from. So it's very difficult to work while you're in a state of occupation because it gets into everywhere in your life. You can't escape it, you can't ignore it. But I think that the biggest battle in the middle of all of that is to let go of the fear, let go of the possibility of negative consequences happening, and to not engage in self-censorship. I mean, to have integrity in your towards your work.
Yeah. I feel as if with Janine, there's a kind of theatricalness to that censorship, in the sense that what you talked about before, about difficulties in getting funding and the effects of the small amount of funding that you did take, Juna, the Israeli funding, affecting the circulation of your films, and the ways in which expectations on Palestinian films affect how they circulate, is another form of censorship that has to be talked about and addressed as well.
Worst form of censorship you have in Israel right now. If you get any money from Israel, you have to call your film Israeli.
Right, that came up with
censorship, but it's there are far more laws that are really dangerous here, and they're getting out like every day. There's a new thing that is happening. Luckily, when I started the film, I didn't sign on the Miri Regev law that says your film is Israeli, but still, I mean, I have to abide to that law. And it's surreal that you, as a Palestinian artist, that you're totally against the Israeli occupation, and you have to call your film Israeli, and Israel has to be put on the film. It's a surreal situation we're living in, and we're trying to produce and create from. I mean, there's a lot of laws against Palestinian creations. They become kind of laws against the creations that are already out. I mean, Juna Suleiman in his first film also was persecuted for not mentioning Israel, even though he got a very small fund from Snonit in his fund from Israel. And he went into court with them and he won. So yeah, I mean, this is the case here. But people who work in film, Israelis who are in the funds and in the industry, are very much different usually from the people who make the laws and sit in the Knesset and those. In general, I mean, you can find few really leftist ones. Yes.
Great. Here's another question from the chat. It's a little bit complex, and I think what he's getting at is the fragmentation of the Palestinian experience. This is from Usama Abdel Nabi, and he says, I'm a Palestinian from Australia. Whoops, it just moved on me, so I can't. Whoops, the question disappeared for me.
You want me to resend
here,
it?
I've got it. Okay. I have found that the way Palestinians view and represent themselves has varied all around the world, and how we're also trapped into reinterpreting ourselves through strange lenses. For instance, Michel Khleifi's wedding in Galilee, Urs al-Jalil, I could never grasp. Was it saying something else to someone else? I was wondering how this was received inside Palestine. And maybe you could speak about the reception of your works among Palestinian communities insofar as that's happened so far.
My film was very well received in Palestine. I mean, my target audience was Palestinian, and usually it's not the target audience of any Palestinian films in general. It was full of nuances from the place that only people from here could understand. It had international elements as well in the story and character. So on that level, I think the film succeeded to bring a story from within, which is very similar and very recognizable by Palestinians themselves within Palestine. You said something about fragmentation. Is it the same question or another?
Well, he starts by saying he's a Palestinian in Australia, and he didn't understand Michel's film and was wondering if it has a different audience from him as a Palestinian in Australia, and that, you know, various films taking different lenses. So
I think the most interesting aspect of fragmentation is that our perception of our narrative is very fragmented, and making narrative film is not an easy job for Palestinians because the narrative still exists in the past. We have in my generation and younger generation have a sort of nostalgia for a period in time we did not live. We know that something was taken away from us and from our culture and from our connectivity to this place. I think that I try to cover them in my work, but the fragmentation, I agree a lot because my perception of the narrative is very fragmented. The way I shot was very fragmented. Editing, I also faced that. I think that's part of the problem of narrative here. Yeah.
I mean,
I don't want to comment on Michel Khalef's film. It's not my. I saw it a long time ago, really long time ago.
It's just an example, I think, he's giving from his personal experience watching a film. And
I don't remember the film so much.
Yeah.
I think that the more I started consuming Palestinian cinema, if we can call it that, I realized that the representation of Palestinians in the films that we are creating is very, very narrow. And it's talking about this certain nostalgia for a period that I think most of the people who created the films did not live. And you know, it's like a broken telephone. Someone tells you something, then they tell you something. So at the end, you get a very filtered version of the occupation and of the events of the Nakba that almost has no relation to what really happened. And for me, I didn't feel like I wanted to deal with these topics in a such indirect way. And my most direct contact with the Nakba was my parents, even though they never shared their memories from the Nakba. And my dad did live through it, and my mom lived the Naksa, but they would never answer my questions when I would try to get some details on their experiences and try to hear their stories.
Yeah, that's very common actually amongst people who have witnessed the Nakba, and there's a lot of study into it. Dr. Himmat Zabi is also talks about this issue a lot in this regard, and she did an entire research with them, and I think it's a very interesting point, the refusal to say something about the past. Or in my grandmother's case, she would say the same line every time that they threw us at Afule, you know, where she was to go. They're supposed to go up to Nazareth by foot. And she remembers that her sister's kid was still a baby, and they had to carry everything and the baby to the church in Nazareth. She doesn't go even backwards in time to how life was there. It's just like this event. She remembers. She remembers the flowers in the garden and everything, but she keeps repeating all over the years the same stuff. If I ask her, she repeats those memories.
Yeah, my dad is the same. Until I really got him to talk about it, it was just a few sentences that would repeat themselves until I got very, very persistent in my asking, and I started getting more answers. But what I was trying to say is that they were my most direct contact with history, and they were my most direct contact with trauma and with tragedy. And that's why I decided to work from them, because apart from what I grew up on and what I experienced at home, everything else I know is from the media, and I didn't want to repeat the same stories that have been repeated for so long. I wanted to really try to just remove all the background noise and see where the trauma and the tragedy encounters me in the most intimate places. And I think
actually that's something we have in common as well. We're finding that out in this conversation. Because also in my grandmother's case, it was an attempt for me to find means of connectedness, because being so overburdened with identity all the time. I mean, being Palestinian dominates every aspect of life. It is impossible that it doesn't dominate your everyday life. Working in film, relationship between people can become toxic, even Palestinian themselves, because the chances are not out there, the opportunities are not out there. So for me also, I was looking to shut down the noise and find the actual true connectedness to this issue, even though I know all the history and I've heard everything, and I keep hearing and I keep seeing. But the problem was, the more you were seeing films that were using those Palestinian cliches, the same symbols, it was making you, repulsed by Palestinian films. This is what happened to me. Like I said, one day I decided I don't want to see Palestinian films anymore. They're very heavy films, and few I get connected to. There are few films that I feel that are treating narrative and character in a different way. And
kind of treating ourselves the way the West treats us. I mean, some of the representations are very dishonest, and they're repeating very very old struggles that right now what we're living through has evolved so much and accumulated so much complexity that is beyond getting evacuated from your home.
And in our case, it's psychological occupation. Don't forget. And in general, if you look at our life, you wouldn't see anything abnormal or something. You wouldn't see what you would see in the West Bank or in Gaza. It's very psychological. It's in the mannerism and minds of people so much. And the relationship with the news is abstract, like you saw it in the film as well. You get agitated because of the news, but you practically can't do anything about it. There's impotence in front of everything.
Yeah. And I think added to that, again, going back to the fragmentation of the Palestinian experience, different communities of Palestinians have different relations to trauma. I mean, and what I mean by that is actual, having your house destroyed or, forced to move or so on across time. And that cannot be distilled into one representation, one narrative. And that's part of the.
But in order to develop narrative and keep on developing, the problem is not getting stuck in the same narrative all the time. In order to develop a narrative, you have to have resources for other types of films and filmmakers, people who have other types of representation they want to show. There's not enough, actually. And the problem.
Let's see, Karim Estefan is asking a question. I think we pretty much covered it in our earlier discussion about the decisions to use intimate domestic spaces and the conditions of being Palestinian in Israel. Aisha Assad is asking about your use of music, Mona, and the songwriting process, which, I'm really curious about how you wrote that song, or had it written if you didn't write it yourself.
No, Moonscape evolved in a very strange way. I mean, at first it began as a lecture performance that was written completely in English. It was basically a narration of all of my experience with the Lunar Embassy. So I wrote that in the form of storytelling, and with the emails considered in mind. I would show them as slideshows when I would talk about the story, and I was like the separate part of the creation was exploring the moon in culture, and specifically in Arabic music and in pop culture. So these were two just like parallel paths I was going through when creating the work, and I thought it was going to be a video essay, and that I was somehow going to use the text as a narration or as any form. But then at some point I just it hit me that it should be a song, because what I'm trying to talk about is the romanticization of the moon and its connection to the bureaucratic journey that I went through with the lunar embassy. So when I realized that, I sat with my friend Bakriye, she's a translator.
Mm-hmm.
We took the research that I made, and we took the text that was already written, and we started simultaneously translating it in the form of a poem and rhyming it together. And then I got together with Dima Azar, the singer who performs the song, and I told her what her parts are going to be. And we did it in my room. She was just, I gave her the lyrics. She would look at them, play a bit with the piano, and start singing. And I recorded them, and I did the same with Ice Rouge. And then we went to the recording studio. I had no idea about how the process is supposed to be. I was completely clueless. I had a deadline at school to present the rough cut. So we went to the studio. We stayed there until 3 a.m. Luay and Dima performed, and then he just sent me the track after I explained the sort of the vibe that I want the song to have. And it just fell in place. I mean, I was very, very lucky to have it work the way it did. But the connection with music, I mean, I can elaborate on that. It's mostly to kind of challenge and reflect upon the elements of nostalgia and of hope, which are very much related to the moon, and also to how the moon appears in songs. I mean, a lot of Arabic music has dealt with it as a symbol of hope and as a symbol of better tomorrows. So turning the research into a song was the most logical thing, because making this very chaotic song about how the moon is the exact opposite of what we're trying to make it be would be the most ironic act I could do. So that's it.
Great. Well, we're talking about Moonscape. Can I ask you to talk about that work in relation to other works of what have been called Palestinian sci-fi? So science fiction. So Larissa Sansour's work, I would say Kamala Jafari's Recollection is a work of sci-fi in some ways. Amil Habibi, where the main Saeed ends up on a pin in outer space.
I mean, I think in order to talk about sci-fi, we kind of need to define it first.
Yeah.
I think that defining it in terms of Palestinian creations is very complex, because it is, the way I see it, it is not exactly science fiction. I mean, it's still also kind of stuck in the past, but the way of portrayal of these you know, futuristic elements and yeah, sorry, I lost my chain of thoughts. But I think that in general, there's a problem with sci-fi. I think it stems from the fact that we are struggling of imagining different or alternative tomorrows, and it's very difficult to imagine how the occupation will end. And I think that is the question that we're all trying to deal with, and that we kind of fail when dealing with. That's why I'm not exactly sure that that Moonscape is a sci-fi movie in that sense, because it is still very much connected to reality, and it is very realistic in the sense that it's a full-on bureaucratic journey. I'm not talking about the fantasy of going to the moon. I'm actually talking about a capitalistic company that's making its money by selling land that you cannot reach. So I think that it's maybe disguised as sci-fi because it has the futuristic elements and hints of symbols that we've seen in other sci-fi films. But it's not it's not exactly that. And in relation to Larissa, I mean, I kind of I kind of have a problem with this comparison, because a few people have mentioned it before, and I was truly shocked when they compared the two works, because the relation between them is purely formal. I think it stems from the fact that we're both Palestinian women, filmmakers, who created the videos that the moon appears in. But our films are almost opposites, because, you know, Larissa's film is a reenactment of a scene from Stanley Kubrick's film.
Yes.
Where she basically plants the Palestinian flag on the moon as an act of giving hope through nationalism.
Yeah.
It's a bit funny, because fun fact that not everybody knows is that all the flags that have been planted on the moon have turned completely white because of solar radiation. So there's no nationalism left there. But in Moonscape, I was aiming for the exact opposite. I was just trying to destroy that hope completely, and I was super aware of it, because, you know, the ultimate thing that will shatter your dreams is bureaucracy, because I think it's what everyone hates most. So bringing that into a culture of romanticization and of you know, everything is nice and everything's butterflies, and we're going to the moon and we're going back from the moon, and things like that, and suddenly hitting them with, you know, the fact of let's get practical about this. I need the passport, I need the land. How am I going to get so so I was confusing the lunar embassy, they were confusing me back, and it just turned out that there isn't no bottom line for the film, apart from the fact that it's not going to happen today. I mean, you're not getting to the moon today, let's leave it for another time. So that, I think, is
Lebanon, which is the most brilliant thing about this film is that it becomes a very simple story beyond the bureaucracy and everything that is being displayed. The impossibility, it speaks about a very simple idea, the impossibility to reach Lebanon. It's as if she does all this, does all of this round in order to get them to give her a passport to reach Lebanon, and then we understand that at the end. Yeah.
And this great suggestion that you get a few stamps in the passport, and that will.
I don't know where I put it, but I actually got one stamp.
Oh wow. So just relatedly quickly, Amanda Batarsa brings up a really relevant quote from the Pez Optimist, and she wants to know whether you had this in mind. The moon is closer to us now than are the fig trees of our departed village. This is a quote from and whether you had that in mind as you made the film.
I didn't, but I think I say something that in one of the email correspondences that is very similar. I mean, that it's more possible for a Palestinian to reach to buy land on the moon than to return to their homeland. But it's nice to know he talks about. I need to read this book, really.
Yeah. Great. Oh boy, we're running out of time. Let me see. I would like to ask you just one or two very specific questions about your film, Juna. I'm curious about the line or the lack of a line between documentary and fiction. In your film, and also the use of media. You've mentioned it in passing earlier about the sort of kind of a violence that the media does. And then maybe we could close with each of you saying a little bit about next projects. And I'm sorry that we can't get to all the questions in the chat.
There is no fiction in my film. Everything was taken from the footage that was shot. In the footage, I did not direct any scene. There was no scene that I told the actors, do that, play like this, do this. Not at all. With my grandmother, it was impossible to direct her. Like she would direct you, not you her.
So I have to wait. The scene in the hospital with the two remote controls is not fiction.
Scene, no, it's not a fiction. It's not fiction. It happened. What happened in the footage is that while I was filming from very different angles. The interaction between them was different. They were speaking to each other while they were also in between, jumping between channels and everything. In the editing, we took only the fight, the remote control fight, because we wanted to show even a deeper truth about the little cultural war that is happening with the Palestinian who no longer has her rights and doesn't speak the language, and the Russian who there's a whole entire little Russia around her in the hospital. So, and this alienation, we also see it when she goes to the commercial center with Kabita, and she looks at the people there. Mm-hmm. So it's to show this precisely. The only thing we inserted in the film, which was not from the material itself, was Netanyahu. Netanyahu on screen, basically. That was the only thing. And also the use of it was to show how much she doesn't care about. Not Netanyahu, not anyone, not politics, not what's happening around her, because she has other stuff to attend to, like, dying and living. So that is regarding to the fiction part, but in general, we use this mechanism in everything we did. Also the part with the election, the hearing, in order to try to be closer to her character. Imagine the world from her point of view, how she listens, what she hears. We had to use those mechanisms, but entirely undirected. Now, the media was an indication of time first, like, at which time she's contextual, like where to contextualize her, if she's in the when Obama is re-elected or Netanyahu being re-elected. So, and some items also around the house, like the old radio transistor, show how much she's been using this form of media. The thing about the media in the film is that there are so many contradicting resources. Like you have the Radio Israel in Arabic, playing the news content of Israel, but Arabic music and programs. You have Al Jadid. You have also the El Mayadeen channel playing very loudly the Syrian uprising, the Arab uprising in general. Since 2012, so these contradicting resources, she needs them because she lives in Israel. She has to get the news about Israel. She has to get the news about the Arab world. This is her only connection to the Arab world. So, but it's we mainly used it as to insert politics in her life, to connect her to the political outside world, and that's in reality. This is how she consumes media as well. Also, the media was our source for music. Every little piece of music we have is from Radio Israel in Arabic. All the sketch music in the beginning, and later on the music they put between programs and stuff, we'll just simply get them out and use them in order to use only from the world of the film. I didn't want to impose anything from the outside.
Great. Fascinating. Would you like to talk about next projects?
I think
or current projects?
I think we can stick to the questions on these projects because me and Juna are working together, but
don't want to tell anybody about it.
We don't want to tell anyone.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Keep us in suspense. That's a great marketing move. So I actually misread the clock, and we do have a few more minutes than I thought. So Anais Amar has a question about advice you might have for young Palestinian filmmakers, young female Palestinian filmmakers. And related, there's a question from Isaba about your experience as female directors and exposing your projects, and do you feel it's easier for men than it is for women in the field? So advice for young women entering the field, whether you see a gender issue in your experiences.
it's a man's field. The film industry is a man's industry. It's very difficult because also the society is patriarchal. We are under occupation. Of course, it's difficult. It's to the level of, that you get a lot of insecurities in what you're doing. Also, the way women work in general is by being, I don't think that we take decisions immediately and think we know everything. I think we work with the process and we understand from the process and decide in it. And if you expose this kind of insecurity to men in the field, it's not easy. Like I was lucky to work with men who weren't like that, who appreciated the fact that it took me a lot of time sometimes to decide and make a proper decision and everything. But in general, it's a cruel environment to work in, and people don't take you seriously. They talk at you in a certain way. Of course, it exists, and it exists as much as it exists in society itself. But there's no advice. We beat them in everything we do. I think that we're strong, we endure, and every time we are broken by men, we are more and more powerful. So, and our films are interesting, and our films are showing something different. In general, Palestinian women are doing very good work in regard to representation of women in film. So yeah, I mean, that's the case. This is what exists here. It's not an easy go.
Yeah. So do you have advice?
Just be true to yourself in the process. And yeah, sometimes you have to fight everybody that are telling you you're wrong in what you're thinking or doing, and be alone in it. And but I mean, I think that no actual advice. It depends on the experience you're having. Some women may not be experiencing that. I don't know.
I think my advice would be to find a few people that you have a good dialogue with, that you can trust to give you an honest feedback when you need it, and you wouldn't need anything more than that. I mean, there's a reason both me and Juna kind of work from our cocoons and not so related to the rest of the industry, but we were very lucky to find each other and to further develop this dialogue between us. So it's an advice as much as it's a real recommendation, just to find someone that you have a
work with women
dialogue with, who understands what you're doing and who isn't afraid to tell you the truth in the face, because the last thing you need as a filmmaker and as someone who's trying to pursue a project is hypocrisy. Literally, the worst comment you can get is I like your work or I don't like your work. It gets you nowhere. So avoid people who give you only these opinions.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like you're suggesting that, find and create and sustain a young woman's network, and forget the old boys network.
Really, some boys are good, but
but yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it's like that.
Yeah. Great. Okay, then the last two questions here. One is specifically to you, Juna, from Sunila Mubai. She's asking, how do you feel about filming your grandmother say racist things about dark-skinned migrant workers? And then the other from Guy Al-Hanan, how do you stay loyal to your artistic values with so many obstacles? Which is, I think, addressed to both of you.
Yeah, we addressed that. Okay, I think that they're funny. I mean, the racist questions coming from her are funny because it's obvious the reason. I mean, she's lying the entire time. She's saying that she's told her, she didn't. This is not why she fired her. We see exactly what happened. So it's coming from a place of, it's a place of ignorance. It's not a place of, she's not active with that sort of racism. She just wants to say, I want someone else. She decided that she hates her and somebody else would be better. I think most of the crowd got it this way. And it's part also of her controversial character as well. I mean, I understand if audiences did not relate to the humor in it. But I think it's a very comic scene, this. And it explains also even more about her. But the problem with Hiyam is because she has so much agency in the film, but you can't judge her, really. You can't be put in a position to judge her and what she thinks. Not at this age, not after everything she's been through. She never was racist before, actually. This is, it happened after a lot of time. Like at this age, you get to depict a lot of hatred coming towards other women who work for her, for example, the woman who came to take care of her. She's a victim herself, but she also turns them into victims when it comes to her. So it's the psychology of it, I think. It's not, she doesn't know this is racist, and that's being racist to say that. So it remains within the context of the scene. I can't generalize this about her or try to protect her from it.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think it's super important that this kind of scenes is shown. I mean, first of all, it adds to the authenticity of the portrait you're trying to create of your grandmother. And I think in general, films should never try to be this, to portray this utopic world where everything is so politically correct and you can't say anything that might offend this and this, because it's just creating a very twisted image of reality that is very disconnected. And if you want people to relate to what you're doing, you have to give them at least a glimpse of what is going on. And this racism exists. I mean, all of our parents are racist. All of our relatives are racist. Almost everyone is racist.
Parents are racist in general.
It's the elephant in the room. So discussing it in films and and I think that putting it in films and having your audience feel uncomfortable about that fact is far more challenging than creating this this utopian racism-free world.
Right.
It's I think it's the most I mean, to me, my biggest compliment is when viewers leave my films feeling uncomfortable, because that's what really gets you to think.
Yes.
I mean, and I think you want people to think about what you're doing and not just have it be this cathartic experience. We go to the cinema to forget our problems. It's not ideal.
Well said. Yeah. Well, thank you both. This has been fascinating for me. I took tons of notes in addition to the notes I took when we met before. And I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity to delve into your works. And thanks you to everyone who came to listen to the conversation, and to those of you who asked questions. And I hope we can all attend later events in the series.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Thanks for the questions. And thanks for having us.
Thank you. All of you.
Thank you so much.